Greetings and welcome. I'm Dr. Mark Pitstick, your host for Ask the Soul Doctors on HealthyLife.net radio. Each month on this show, we discuss important consciousness topics that impact your life here and now. We don't claim to have all the answers or the only answers, but we do have some very good answers that have helped many people make more sense of their Earth experiences. With us today is Dr. Karen Wyatt, MD, a family practice physician who spent nearly 25 years caring for dying patients in hospice centers and other settings. Her work with the dying inspired her to write the book, What Really Matters, 7 Lessons for Living from the Stories of the Dying. She also wrote a book, A Matter of Life and Death, Stories to Heal Loss and Grief. Dr. Wyatt also hosts the What Really Matters radio show and an online interview series entitled End of Life University that features interviews and conversations about all aspects of the end of life. Her website is KarenWyattMD.com. That's KarenWyattMD.com. So be sure to visit her site to learn more about all of her wonderful services and products. So, Karen, welcome and thank you for joining us.
Hi, Mark. Thank you so much for inviting me to be on your show.
Oh, my pleasure. I really loved your wonderful book, What Really Matters, and as we shared when we emailed before the show, I was moved to tears several times. It's full of very important points for people of all ages, whether they're in the full bloom of youth or facing imminent death. So I'm honored to interview such a wise and caring physician who obviously thinks and acts from a deeply evolved level. Before you get a big head, let's dive in here. And there's so many things to address on this topic. In your book, you state, the process, and this is a quote, the process of growing spiritually, of becoming more conscious and aware, consists of being able to view life from the galaxy even while you toil in the garden. Would you say more about that, please?
Yes, it's a point that became clear to me as I was working with hospice patients and experiencing death and dying, that there are different perspectives we can take on life itself and how we're living our life. And so I just thought of the idea that it's the garden view is really like our day-to-day experience of life, and the troubles we have during life, the work we're trying to do, the day-to-day struggles that we go through each day. But the galaxy view is this view from higher consciousness, really, and I also kind of think of it as the soul view of what life is really about. And it's getting the big picture for each of our lives of why am I here on this planet anyway? Why am I even doing this? Why am I here, and what is this life about? And for me, as soon as I discovered this galaxy view of my own life and was able to take a higher perspective, it made everything fall in place. And suddenly all the troubles that happened in the garden view, getting stuck in traffic, having the plumbing go out in the house, and all the things that we deal with each day seem very minor, because suddenly you just realize those are small occurrences that are just opportunities for me to learn things and to grow from.
Very good. And it seems to me that this dual perspective is a prerequisite for having a peaceful, joyful, successful life experience. When I read that, your description, and I love that, viewing life from the galaxy, even though while you're toiling in the garden, it reminded me of the biblical admonitions reminding us that we are in this world, but we're not solely of this world. It also made me think about native wisdom teachers who encourage us to live with one foot in the physical here on Earth, but also one foot in whatever you want to call it, spiritual dimensions, the non-physical.
Yes, I love that. And I will say, from my earlier spiritual practices when I was younger, Sometimes I found myself too much in that galaxy view. Sometimes I found myself too much trying to be in a higher spiritual plane and sort of ignoring the physical life on the garden and this planet. And so one of the things as I've gotten older is I've recognized, like, this life just has many amazing, wonderful things, this physical life on Earth. And so I've done a much better job of balancing those perspectives and remembering that it's really important to experience life on Earth and everything that it offers to us while we're here.
Sure. It's an exquisite opportunity. And speaking of getting older, as I do, it seems to me less and less that there are any separations, any dividers. In other words, in the past I would say, well, there's this world and then the other side. Well, how's that work? I mean, you go way out in the ionosphere and all of a sudden here's this fence. You are now approaching the other side. So really I think as we awaken to the vastness and the beauty of life, we realize, we're not disconnected from God. We're not disconnected from eternity or anywhere. It's just life unfolding right now, and we're integral parts of that.
That's exactly true. I agree with that totally. So that in some ways, there isn't really a separation between this galaxy view and garden view. It's a way of expressing the differences, but it's all one. It's all the same thing.
Well, in your work with so many dying people and their families, you obviously encountered lots of suffering, and you wrote, our difficulties in life open the door to our transformation. Suffering, when fully embraced, can lead to finding a higher purpose and creating a fulfilled life. Could you say a bit more about that, please?
That was one of the first observations I was able to make from working with dying patients, and which really was this profound opportunity to sit at the bedside with people who were facing the very end of their life, and as you mentioned, nearly all of them going through a lot of physical suffering and emotional suffering, but having this chance to participate with them and observe it, and then also learn from them, to be able to hear their stories and listen to what they were struggling with and what they wanted to talk about. It really made it clear to me that we spend a lot of our lives trying to avoid suffering, and that a lot of kind of the commercial material goods of our lives are out there to try to help us ease and avoid suffering, and that applies to Western medicine too. We've created drugs to help people avoid any type of suffering if possible, but in reality, suffering itself, if instead of running from it or trying to figure out a way to get out of it or to prevent it from happening, if we can just sit with it, which is what my dying patients had to do. They had no choice. They no longer had a means of escaping. They had to sit and confront their mortality, confront their illness, confront what was happening to them, that they were able to find a great deal of peace within that suffering, but also by simply embracing it and accepting this is how it is. This is just what is in my life right now. Many of them found this path to higher awareness and higher consciousness through being present within the suffering that they were encountering.
Awesome. And for those who are suffering but who aren't dying, it's important for them to fully embrace that as well. Sometimes people are tempted to blot out the, quote, sad and bad feelings with alcohol, drugs, medications. There are all kinds of distractions. But when we do that, we miss the lessons, the opportunities for growth. I'm recalling the song by Garth Brooks years ago, I could have missed the pain, but I would have missed the dance, and we don't want to miss that dance. I thought of when you were talking about difficulties in life open the door to our transformation. I think it's important that we not limit those opportunities to just this one lifetime. In other words, I'm thinking of a Michael Newton, Ph.D., author of Journey of Souls and whatever his other one is The Journey of Souls. He's the founder of Spiritual Regression, Destiny of Souls, 4-hour deep regressions under deep hypnosis where people recall their lives between lives, where they are in spiritual dimensions in between incarnations like on Earth. And one woman was recalling a previous physical life where she failed at everything. No matter what she tried, it went wrong. And when she died, she thought her life was a total failure. Well, then when she crossed over, she learned that all of that testing her spirit strengthened her spirit so much that she was prepared then to counsel the souls of people who had just passed on, who had been babies abused to death on Earth. And because, again, that depth of soul that she developed as a result of all her adversity and seeming failures, she was able to stay with those people and deal with that immense amount of pain and shock. So life is much bigger and more lawful and safe than we can imagine.
Oh, that's so true, and that's a perfect example, too, of the galaxy view is just so different than our view in the garden. You know, from the garden, it does look like we have failure, we have things go wrong, we have terrible losses, but when we're aware that there's this higher view and a higher soul perspective on everything that's happening in our lives, there's so much more meaning to all of it than that, and there's so much greater purpose and depth for everything that we're experiencing.
That's when we can relax and say, okay, here we go, it's an adventure. It helps you understand. For example, when I was in martial arts, this was Japanese karate, and there was a saying, today is a good day to die. And at first I'm like, what? And then I realized, hey, when you have the right perspective, you're ready for anything. If I die today or if I live to 110, it's all good, it's all God.
Yes. Oh, that's so much the message that I wanted to come through this book, because that's exactly what I learned from my dying patients, was to live life every day with that attitude so that you can make the most of whatever opportunities you have while you're here.
Sure. Well, one of the areas that I think trip people up is the impermanence of life. And you have a great quote in your book. You say impermanence. So this is talking about the fleeting nature of this earthly life. In other words, I think we have to be really conscious with our language. Life, maybe with a capital L, is eternal, infinite, ever-changing, but never-ending. But, of course, this earthly experience is finite and can be very fleeting. So you say impermanence is essential, is the doorway through which change arrives. Without impermanence, stagnation would result, a quagmire of lifeless sameness. Great language, by a quagmire of lifeless sameness. I love it. So what else would you like to share with listeners about that one?
Well, I think that lesson of impermanence is really obvious in nature, or if we go back to the garden again and you do gardening, because it's so clear that the garden, anything that grows has to die as part of its cycle, and it has a cycle of death. And so when you spend time in nature and you see how, the energy in a tree never disappears, but it changes form when that tree dies, and then its nutrients are reabsorbed. And that's what allows the forest to continue to grow and change and evolve, is this process and the cycle of life and death. And I think once we see ourselves as fitting into that cycle, we can relax a little bit, like you said, relax some of our fears about the fact that we, too, are part of this. Our physical bodies are part of this same life experience on Earth, and they will go through the same cycle and the same process, even though our souls will not. Our souls will live eternally, but we have to accept we have these physical bodies that we are going to lose at some point. Sure.
And really, it's a beautiful way, if a person thinks about it a bit, it's it's the only way life can be set up. I encourage people to think about their favorite movie or their favorite book and consider which one of those, no matter how much you love it, would you like to watch every day, all day. Obviously, you grow sick and bored of it, and that's one of the biggest reasons why I think we enjoy experiencing life from different times and places. My mom and I were recently having a conversation. She's 83. My dad has passed on 7 years now, and she really misses him, and she's ready to pass on, and she was lamenting. She said, well, why couldn't life just be the same when your dad and I were 35, and we would go dancing, we had a large circle of friends, and you children were young and cute, and she said, why couldn't things just stay like that forever when I was 35? And I said, Mom, think about it. If you were 35 forever, I would be 12 forever. I said, who would want to be stuck in puberty for eternity? What is that hell for you? So it's important that we not have these expectations versus opening to how life really is.
And that's another good point, that sometimes it's our own expectations that lead us into feeling disappointed with life because we set up for ourselves unrealistic expectations or expectations that aren't even true and that aren't possible. And when we let go of those, we can so much more focus on just how things are instead of projecting out into the future how we wish things would be or what we would like life to be like. We can simply appreciate what it is like right now in this moment.
Yes, and that's why I think it's so important. You mentioned the paradoxical nature of life. You know, when you realize life is impermanent, but at the same time, it's eternal. And that boggles the mind. That blows the computer circuits at first, but then after when you play with it, it's important for us to understand both those areas. I know Buddha had some wonderful quotes about the transient nature of life, like a flash of lightning in the sky, like the droplets of water that go up into the air just momentarily when a wave crashes. And so that part represents the transient nature of this human experience. But both those phenomena continue on. The energy of the lightning isn't destroyed. It changes form. The droplets rejoin the vast ocean and reveal their real nature as interconnected with all that is.
I love that. I love those images of just that cycle, how everything cycles, and everything that is alive in life right now will contribute its the energy and the life force from its life to something else in a different form at another time in this process.
Yes. And that takes opening the heart and mind to get both of those. But when we do, I think that really frees us up and removes the fear. It's like, okay, well, that's the name of the game. In other words, every game we play has its own set of rules. And once you learn the rules, you know how to play the game. Well, once you learn what's been referred to as the master game and realize things always change, but things don't end, and it's really safe, and it's really all connected. It's just God breathing. Then you can really enjoy what is this magnificent life. Well, let's start on the next one. We'll have to take a break in a bit, but let's get started. So the question is, after all your experience as a medical doctor and working with so many dying people, is there first any doubt in your mind that death is an end versus a new beginning?
No, I mean, there's so much that we could say about that, but it's very clear to me that there's as we talked about, a physical death on planet Earth, but an ongoing existence of the soul that is eternal and immortal. I guess I would have to say, just for me personally, the evidence has just come to me from my experiences, and back many years ago when I was, before I ever even started working in hospice, I had a friend, my best friend from high school, died when we were 29. And a few years after her death, I had a dream, which wasn't real, to me wasn't really a dream, but I saw her in the dream, and she came to me, and she looked like she looked when we were 14, when we were, palling around together at 14. She had her hair in braids, and she was beautiful, and she was transparent and full of light and full of love. And she came to me and said, I have to go now, and I need you to say goodbye to me. And she said, you haven't said goodbye yet, and I need you to say goodbye and to know how much I love you, but I have other things I have to do now, so I have to leave you. And that dream, which I felt was more of a vision of her soul really coming to me and saying to me that she needed to move on to some other realm and asking me to let her go and say goodbye to her. And that was so profound. And in my mind, I had no doubt that she was still existing. Her soul existed somewhere else. And she had come to me to say goodbye. And that was the very first time I had ever had an experience like that. But throughout my work in hospice, I had a number of, I refer to them as dreams, but in my own mind, I see them as being more visions. They come to me in the middle of the night. But I've had other experiences of seeing patients after they died. Sometimes some patients I actually saw right before they died, and they came to me in that same form, being transparent and full of light and love, and with usually always looking whole and healthy, and quite a bit younger than they were at the time of their death. So for me, those experiences were very profound and so meaningful. I just have not ever questioned it, though I understand that other people would. Other people who hear the story might say, that sounds crazy, you're just having dreams. But for me, those experiences were so profound and real that I don't doubt at all that there is an afterlife and there is a soul existence for us.
Wow. So, obviously you're aware of the near-death experience research and the other clinical evidence, but as you say, your personal experiences are so powerful, you don't need any other proof, really.
Yes, and I totally accept the experiences of other people, too, because when I hear about them, and read accounts from other people who've had near-death experiences, I feel a similar sense in their stories to what I was able to feel when I've had those dreams of mine at night, and so it all fits with me. And I read Michael Newton's book, Journey of Souls, and that book just felt very much in line with what I had been experiencing and what kind of this wisdom or knowledge that I felt had been imparted to me.
I know when I read that, I felt like that book had answered more questions I'd had since I was a youth than any other book I'd ever read in my life. So, yeah. Well, we're definitely kindred spirits here, and it seems to me to speak that you must be a pretty evolved spirit, and you don't have to be humble to even detect, first of all, to detect your friend's communication in your dream, and secondly, to acknowledge it and take heart in it. In other words, some people say, oh, it was a crazy dream. So that suggests to me that you have been around more than this one lifetime, certainly, and we appreciate your sharing your life. Well, let's, now that we've kind of set this stage, let's get into some edgier topics. And I worked in hospitals for 6 years when in my 20s as I went through pre-med and theology school, and was a respiratory therapist. Spent almost my whole time in ICUs and ERs, and was with hundreds and hundreds of people as they died. I was in on all the codes. I was kind of the hotshot young guy. This is in the early to mid-70s, and unbelievably, actually back then I could do intubations, arterial blood gas punctures, cardiopulmonary resuscitation, all kinds of things that I really probably shouldn't be doing as a young 20-year-old. But anyway, so like you, I've been around a lot of death and have seen things that most people don't see, but more people are waking up to. For example, one of the one of the codes we had was on a 93-year-old gentleman. This guy he was a double amputee because of cancer. He had heart failure, kidney failure. His lungs were shot. And even so, when he started to die, they coded him. And, I was kind of the kid that noticed the emperor didn't have any clothes back then. And so I asked the chief resident, why are we doing this? And he said, a teaching hospital is a horrible place to die, or to try to die, which was an honest answer. But the other thing, which you and I discussed before, Orthodox medicine sees death as a failure, and they'll do everything possible to prevent even a timely passing. So what are your comments about that? What have you noticed?
Oh, I've had some, during my training, just as you experienced, so many of those encounters with a patient who really should have just been comforted and helped to die peacefully, who had to go through this whole process of being coded, and then sometimes their heart started beating again, and they would live for another hour and then code again and have to be resuscitated. And so I had a number of experiences like you of seeing the futility of this medical care that we try to provide at the end of life.
Yes. Well, and also a lot of people who have not been in hospitals don't realize how often those inappropriate codes produce, we use the term vegetables. People in vegetative states, contractured, in fetal positions, wasting away, brain dead, and it's no way to live. Before the break, we were discussing a very important point about timely dying and the barriers to that happening. We talked about how Orthodox medicine sees death as a failure. It will do everything possible. Now, this doesn't take into consideration the profit factors. This is just because they're trained to do that. They're trained to do everything you can to prevent a life, even when it's going to result in suffering for the patient, really a lack of dignity, continued existence. So, baby boomers, of course, now are approaching that age where either our parents are passing or, some even baby boomers are dying, and they've been raised to question authority, to see through the BS, and I know they want a better way to die. So we discussed one factor, Dr. Wyatt. It seems to me that there are a few others. But before we get into that, what else would you like to say about how Orthodox medicine trains physicians to see death as a failure?
Well, that's something I've thought about a lot. The fact that we in medical training we really don't learn anything about the process of death and dying, and because medicine is based on rational science, there's no acceptance of a higher perspective, the galaxy view that we were talking about, and no acceptance of a deeper purpose for life or a soul purpose, so that life is just viewed primarily in the physical realm only, and so our training is completely lacking in any other perspective on what's important in life or what else might matter. And then also I think many doctors themselves have never done their own spiritual work to face their own fears of death and dying. So that's a factor too, because it's hard for us to address dying with a patient if we ourselves are in denial about it and don't want to go there and don't want to look at it. It's much easier to just continue to prescribe drugs and treatments and therapies to try to prevent death than it is to confront it. So I think those are really big factors of affecting Western medical practitioners, and I know some wonderful, amazing, compassionate, caring doctors who still do a terrible job dealing with death and dying with their patients because they haven't been trained and they're not comfortable with it. So we're at a point where we really can't rely on doctors right now to change our experience with death and dying. It really will take baby boomers stepping up for themselves and advocating for themselves and saying, I want to make choices about my own death and dying and how that takes place. I'm not waiting for some doctor to lead me in the right direction. I want to figure out what's right for me and then advocate for that.
I exactly agree. Good for you. Well, another obvious barrier is fear of death, but we've discussed that already, that death is just a change, not an end, and change is an essential part of life. So hopefully as people learn the evidence that no one really dies, and work such as mine and such as yours, that fear of death will be relieved. Well, another factor we alluded to earlier, the profit considerations. And well, let's dive in on that. First of all, Paul Zane Pilzer is an economic advisor to 3 presidents, has written a number of books. He says that the disease care industry now is $3 trillion per year. That's trillion as in T, business in the U.S. And that this vast amount of money funds research that skews results. It buys the best lobbyists. It unduly influences lawmakers. And, of course, as Mark Twain said, America has the best politicians that money can buy. It's just the way the system is set up right now. Big business pays lobbyists. Lobbyists influence lawmakers. They set the laws. So, first of all, to your knowledge, does big business affect healthcare policies and end-of-this-life policies in other countries like it does the U.S.?
I think it's, and again, I'm not an expert on this, but it appears to me that it's somewhat less in other countries, and in just the conversations I've had with people, it's partly because other developed nations have national healthcare systems, and so the healthcare isn't a big business. It's not as big an economic boon as it is in our country because of capitalism and private entities being able to just do what they want within healthcare to make profits and make money. I think we have it's a terrible mixed incentive in our healthcare. As you were saying, I think profit definitely influences the research that's being done, how that research gets reported, and how patients get treated.
Yeah. Well, a fourth, and as I'm like you, I think about this a lot. I guess that makes us odd that we think about such matters, but they're important. Another would be religious concerns. In other words, some people say, well, if we assist dying, we're playing God. And that, of course, conjures up images of a big God in the sky who decides who's going to die, when, where, and how. But what they don't take into account is every time we treat pneumonia or do dialysis, we're preventing death. We're playing God then, affecting the timing. So what would you have to say to people who have religious concerns about assisting a timely death versus people just suffering?
Yeah, I would say in some ways we're trying to play God when we preserve life through artificial means, through CPR and intubating someone and putting them on a ventilator and trying to prolong physical life when it's clearly not natural, not the natural course of things. And so I do understand the concern about not wanting to assist people to end their lives prematurely. My concern is that some of the patients who might want to terminate their lives prematurely haven't had appropriate care, haven't had pain relief or symptom relief, or haven't had enough spiritual help with their symptoms. And so I would want to know that they made that choice having received everything that's available for them out there to help them, and have still come to the same conclusion that they would rather terminate their lives earlier rather than finish out the process in its natural course. But I guess I guess I have to say, as I agree with you, that in many ways, medicine is at this point kind of playing God in many ways, because many people would just die of their illnesses and their injuries if we were not intervening and stopping the natural process that's taking place.
Right. Well, you mentioned something that makes me want to go back just a bit to the profit considerations, which is the huge toll on our economy. You probably know statistics better than I do, that how much money is spent in the last few months of a senior citizen's life, expenses that often don't extend the quality or quantity of life, yet it's a vast financial output. So it's not simple by any means, but these are issues that need to be addressed. And I think with an undergirding of knowledge of the big picture, the view from the galaxy, I think everything will proceed better. We've been talking about barriers keeping us from conscious dying, from handling that in the best way, given all factors, certainly the suffering of the patient, the quality of life, dying with dignity, financial concerns, both from the big business viewpoint and on our nation's economy, and families who have life savings wiped out over care. So again, not simple, but certainly we're starting the discussion on that. So we mentioned that before the break, emotional complexities, and as I mentioned, I had a friend had a mother die. She was 90 years old. She was ready to go, multiple organ failure and all. And the family was stating her wishes, and no, she didn't want to be trached and be on a ventilator and all of that support and be in a nursing home. But they were made to feel guilty. Actually, these doctors are saying, well, we were trained to never give up on anyone, and you never know, she could pull out. And so even though the family was carrying out their loved one's wishes, they felt guilty about it. And, that guilt carried on even well after her death. So I know you've been around a lot about that. What are your comments about the emotional complexities involved, please?
Well, it's definitely a difficult time, and my own mom died last year. She was very clear about her wishes. She didn't want anything done. She didn't want to be in the hospital or a nursing home, and she was clear. She'd filled out a living will, and we'd had many conversations, and then here I am, with my experience and everything I write and talk about, but being the person with, I was her healthcare advocate and being the person making the decisions, I discovered how difficult it really is when you're in the moment, and when I had to say to the doctors, no, we're not treating this, I'm taking her home. And so I have total empathy for the family caregivers in that circumstance, that it's very challenging, even when you know exactly what your loved one wanted and you know it's what you want, but it's challenging in the moment to have the courage to just say, I know my mom might have lived another month or two if we'd kept her in the hospital, but she didn't want to be there. And so, to have the courage to say, no, stop, I'm taking her home, and I'll take care of her at home, is a big step. And that's one of the reasons I'm out there writing and speaking, is to try to help people have that courage to do what they know their loved ones want. And maybe they will have to stand up to medical providers and say no, as I did, and say, no, I don't want what you have to offer. We're doing this instead. So it's my hope. I'm trying to be a support person out there for all those family members who are making the tough decisions.
Wow, excellent. Well, on your website, I noticed one of the statements, Karen Wyatt, the spiritual MD, and you certainly are, and good for you. So paint us a picture, please. We've got about 4 or 5 minutes left, and in your opinion, with everything you've been through personally and professionally, what would be if this were a perfect world, way for people to pass on?
Well, you might remember I had a story in the book about a woman, Lorraine, who was a higher consciousness person. She herself had been a lifelong meditator involved in spiritual practice. She was very conscious, and she wanted to die a conscious death, and she actually did. She talked to me about it quite a bit and was very sure that when it was the right time for her to go, she would just go and be able to die. And she was the first patient I worked with who I saw successfully. She knew in her mind, when I have so much pain that I need to take pain medications, that's when I'll know it's time, and then I will just go. And sure enough, she did. It took about 3 days, and she was gone. She died. And my mom, in the same way, I took her home and came to take care of her, and she had been very conscious about wanting to die at home, wanting to die without a lot of treatment or a lot of care. She died in 5 days after I took her home. And just a month or so ago, a woman I know in my community in the same way was very well prepared to die and had all of her family around her and just said, I'm ready to go whenever it's the right time. And so consciousness was the big factor for each one of them in being willing to face and accept death. And the friend of mine who died last month, I went to visit her the last time I saw her before I died. She whispered to me, I'm dissolving very quickly. And that's how it felt to her. The physical body was dissolving away. And yet she was radiantly beautiful, so happy, and completely filled with love. And her family was just blessed by being in her presence as she was dissolving, as she described it, into death. And so for me, those deaths have been the most beautiful and profound experiences, and I believe that it's possible for many of us, but we have to do the work to get to that place of consciousness, to have a death like that.
In these cases, did these people have a relative lack of fear of death, and did they have a fairly well-developed spirituality?
Yes. In all three cases, that was true. And the woman, my friend who died last month, she read my book 3 years ago and had her whole family read the book, and she said to me, I'm simply living by what really matters. That's how I'm living. I'm living my life by those lessons. And she said, that's all I'm focusing on every day.
Just one case like that makes it all worthwhile, doesn't it?
Yeah, it was profound for me to see that and to see that she said, reading the book, she had a tremendous amount of fear about death, and she'd been actively pursuing aggressive treatment for her cancer. But once she read the book, she said it completely changed her, and she lost her fear and decided, you know what, I'm just going to be with whatever happens now. And so...
Good for you. Well, that's why I wanted to have you on the show. I mean, this book really needs to be read by everyone, as I say, when you're young, so you can prepare for that eventuality, because you never know when your time to pass on is, and certainly if you're older, and certainly if you're facing imminent death. So, What Really Matters by Dr. Karen Wyatt. Awesome. And your description of the conscious dying really takes care of all the barriers. There's the lack of fear. Of course, anytime you approach a big change, like you just got back from a big trip, dying is a big trip, and of course there's going to be a little consternation, but there's certainly not the fear. And then that conscious approach to dying takes out big business, it takes out orthodox medicine, seeing it as a failure. You don't have to worry about religious concerns, and the family doesn't have to worry about making the decision because the person passes on when it's time. So, simple, elegant solution, I think. Well, thank you so much for joining us. Unfortunately, I have to go, but we will be in touch. And again, listeners, be sure to visit her website, KarenWyattMD.com. Thank you again so much.
Thank you, Mark.